to One More Mana. My name's Derik, and today we are jumping into another deck tech, and we're jumping back into Jumpstart because there are just so many awesome commanders from Jumpstart. I wanted to take one more look back to go ahead and build around one of the cards that's inspired me the most. And like everybody, we find inspiration in some weird places sometimes. And I've honestly been super into the show Kingdom on Netflix, and this show is just awesome. If you haven't watched it, watch it. It's super exciting. It's basically, long story short, about a family that makes really poor decisions and likes to fight stuff. Kind of sums it up, and it inspired me. I'm really enjoying it. So you know what? It made me want to fight things. It made me want to go ahead and let out my inner MMA fighter. But then I realized a couple things. I realized I don't have good hand-eye coordination, and I'm not very aggressive, or I'm not a very large person either. So didn't seem like a good idea to actually fight things. So I think instead, we're going to go ahead and bring the fight to the EDH table and build around Neyith of the Dire Hunt. Now, if you want any of the cards in this deck, any of the cards in general from the sets that just keep coming with Jumpstart, Double Masters, Zendikar, Rising Pre-Order is going to start, all these crazy things, head over to TCG Player to help you keep track of everything. Any cards you want, anything like that, you can find at TCG Player. If you use the affiliate link down below in the description, anything and all you get through that link will help support the channel. We really, really do appreciate all the help. All right, now jumping back into Neyith. I already said we're trying to bring the fight to the table with this Neyith deck, and Neyith is just an awesome commander. Neyith is 2 and 2 green for a 3/3 human warrior. Obviously, it's got to be a warrior with some really interesting abilities. And the first one is what kind of gets you thinking. It's basically anytime any of your creatures fight or become blocked, and one or more creatures, so that's going to be important, you get to draw a card. The reason that matters is if you swing with the board of creatures and they all become blocked, you're still only drawing one card, and it's each instance of fighting. So it's not, if you have some effect that somehow lets you just fight a million things, you're not drawing a million cards. It's each instance. So that is something that's going to be important. But also at the beginning of each combat, you get a little weird baby Xenagod effect where you can pay 2 and a Gruul hybrid to go ahead, double the power of one of your creatures and force it to be blocked if it can. Now that Gruul hybrid mana on the triggered ability is obviously very important because this is a Gruul deck and not a mono green deck, which for a fighting deck is very helpful because there's some awesome effects we're going to get in red. And obviously, if you're building a fight deck, you got to have red in there. The aggression of red not being in a fight deck would just be way too big of a flavor fail to me for me to be okay with. So we're definitely making sure the red's in there. Now, one of the things I think Neyith is best at is acting as just a less aggressive, explosive version of Xenagod, which might seem like a slight to it, but I think this can be a good thing. One thing I've noticed about Xenagod, and it's one of my favorite decks, I think Xenagod's an awesome commander. The thing about it is, though, it can be a little much. Sometimes the deck goes off so fast or can be so aggressive that you're in a position to kill people before you might be comfortable with doing so. You might want to play at a slower pace. Your meta might not be ready for the Xenagod deck who on turn 6 is swinging for somebody for lethal. That might not be what you're trying to do. And I think Neyith fits in this place where it can still be an effective and decently strong deck without the immediate kill out of nowhere effect of a Xenagod. Now, again, that might seem like a slight, but I think that gives Neyith a spot in Commander it wouldn't otherwise have just being a worse Xenagod. It's not worse, it's just different, and I do really think it's going to find a happy home in a lot of metas for EDH. Now, obviously, like I said, we're here to fight figuratively at the EDH table, so we want to make sure we have fight effects. And in this deck, one of the most important things to me is we want to have fight effects on our creatures, not so much having instants and sorceries that fight primarily. And the reason this is if you draw an instant or a sorcery to act as your source of removal, but you don't have a creature big enough to fight, or you don't have one of the creatures you want fighting out, that's a dead card in your hand. But if you have big creatures that on themselves say they get to fight, you have the card and that's all you need. You don't need 2 pieces, you just need the 1. So I'm going to heavily favor in this deck creatures that allow themselves to fight, as opposed to, now I'm going to put other fight effects of course in the deck, but I think that's important to point out, and a big flaw that you could kind of run into building the deck. If you go too heavy with non-creature fight effects, so many times they're going to end up being dead cards post board wipe early game, or if someone removes your big creatures. Again, it's just going to make it less frustrating for you making sure those effects are on creatures. So speaking of those creatures, let's go ahead and dive into them and see some of my favorite creatures that are trying to bring the fight to the table. Apex Alphasaur is just an easy include. This is one of the most awesome enrage fighting type effects. It's basically a board wipe creature through fighting. This is just a really awesome effect because you can just draw a card onto that. It makes it even better. It's a very high mana cost card, but we're in Gruul, we can ramp hard. Really, really powerful card. Another just one of my favorites that I'm finding myself again, I feel like every week I mention it, it's Brash Taunter. This card is awesome. This is just so much fun. In this deck specifically, it's a consistent fight effect you can have with an indestructible creature that allows you to draw cards. Barrage Taunter is going to be one of the most powerful cards in this deck because of its indestructibility and having the repeated card draw, repeated effect where you keep fighting things over and over. It's an awesome card. I just think this card needs to, I think it should be everywhere. I think it's just one of those cards that even if it's not the ideal card for a deck, it's always going to be a fun card. The next card I want to take a look at is Kogla, the Titan Ape, aka we couldn't call you King Kong because of legal reasons. This thing is awesome. It is so powerful. We get so many effects. It already acts as removal. When it fights, it can remove artifacts and enchantments. And then, you know what? Throw the draw card onto it because of our commander. This is a really, really cool card. There's so many cards like this now that have just so many lines of text that they do a million different things. And it's a little bit scary on the power creep side of things, but it's also awesome to have so much versatility for a creature that also works as something to beat face with. Another card that can fight things, which is great, is Ravager Worm. And this is a funny one because, like, with Ravager Worm, I remember seeing this card and I saw it was just a big dumb mythic that was probably going to be good and limited and not playable in EDH. And I was determined, you know what? Those are my favorite cards to force into decks, and this is the deck that actually fits it. Riot's already really cool because with our commander, unlike Xenagod, our commander doesn't give haste. So Riot's actually useful if we need to beat face out of nowhere. But just being able to enter and fight something, it's a really awesome card. I'm a big fan of it. Art's cool, which always helps. But again, these are the type of cards we want. We want all of these fight effects and really a critical mass of the creatures fighting. Because again, this can double as removal and card draw all on one card. It's really important that we get all of those. Because individually, and this is kind of true of all these, individually the fight effect is decent. Individually the body on the creature is decent. Individually the draw one card is decent, but combined, it's a value engine that really can become overwhelming if we get enough of these out. Now there's a number of these fight effects. I'm not going to list all of them here, but there's quite a few. But the thing is, we need other creatures that are going to supplement this that can also work to further our strategy. Because our commander does pump creatures, and because it makes them big, but it also forces them to be blocked, trample is critical. So creatures themselves with trample are great, but also other effects to spread that trample. So we got stuff like Goreclaw, Ronus the Indomitable, we got Nylea. There's plenty of creatures that can grant trample, and that's really important to have in there because, again, fighting is great to remove things, but we need to get damage in, and trample is a wonderful way to do that. Another card I'm going to talk about, feels like nonstop, is going to be Terror of the Peaks, another pushing damage through card. We can play big creatures that fight things and also throw damage at people's faces. It's a really important means to go ahead and force that damage through. We'll get more into detail on the game-winning step, but we need to remember when we're putting these creatures in that just the value of fighting, removing, drawing isn't enough. We need a way to push damage through to just further the end point of the game. With the enchantments, one of the most important ones is going to be Rhythm of the Wild. Rhythm of the Wild is super important in this deck because, again, haste. We don't get haste from our commander, which is really, really important because when I'm building this deck, the whole time my brain is set to Xenagod. The whole time that's what I'm thinking, and forgetting that that doesn't give haste made it really difficult. And there were so many cards I had to go ahead and slot it at the end because it's just, that's something you don't think about. If you've ever played Xenagod, your mind's going to be set that way. And even if you haven't, playing these big creatures, you don't want to have a massive creature. Even if you get the value of fighting, you want to be able to swing with it right away. Otherwise, it's just too easy a target to remove. So Rhythm of the Wild is great to give things haste. And one, Garruk's Uprising is just one of the most absurd cards, especially for an uncommon that's been printed recently, because the decks that can take advantage of this will completely break it. Upon entering, it helps draw you a card. When you're playing your creatures, you're drawing cards, and it gives the trample I just talked about that we need so badly. This card is completely insane. One of my favorite cards that's been printed recently, in the fact that it breaks the decks it goes into. In the artifacts, we have some staples in here that you'll go ahead and see, but the one I do want to point out is going to be Dolmen Gate. Dolmen Gate is incredibly important in this deck because if you can just swing without having to worry about your creatures taking damage all of a sudden, that's one of the biggest things with aggro decks that's tough, the decision making, because there's so many opponents. If you swing out, you're not only afraid to be tapped out, but you're also afraid of your creatures just dying from blocks and just wasting it. With this, you can basically swing with no regard for your own creature's safety, get the benefit of the block drawing you a card because of your commander, and also with all the trample and stuff we have, still getting damage through. This is a really, really powerful card, and in a deck with a lot of big creatures, that where your power is getting doubled, you're not doubling your toughness. So being able to keep your creatures alive with this is super important. With the instance, we have a lot of staples in here. We're running the basics, the Crossing Grips, the Heroic Interventions, those types of things. And in this type of deck, you're going to want zero surprises. I will say Return of the Wild Speaker is a really, really cool card that I think will become a staple in that you're able to pump your creatures and you can just draw a bunch of cards off of it at instant speed. It's kind of ridiculous. It's a really powerful card, and it's a versatile enough card that it kind of just fits into most green decks. If green has creatures, this is basically going to be good in there. And I think it's a card that you might want to try slotting in, and you'd be surprised by how much of an effect you get out of it. And with the sorceries, we have lots and lots of ramp. Basically, any deck that's not worried about fast mana, sorcery-based ramp is going to be your best bet if you have access to it. So we put plenty in here, not to mention all the huge creatures we have. We want a lot of ramp. So this is where we're going to find most of that. Having huge creatures also grants us benefits, and cards I've talked about tons in past deck techs. Stuff like Traverse the Outlands, where we can get crazy ramp from having a big creature, or something like Rich Card's Expertise, where we can get crazy card draw and cast a free spell off of having big creatures. It's great to have the benefit just because we know we're going to have those creatures out most of the time. A card I really love though is Roar of the Challenge, because this is going to allow you to either get damage through or just go ahead and just wipe somebody's board with one of your massive creatures. It's a lot of flexibility. You're almost always going to have a creature with power 4 or greater if you're going to cast this, so the creature is going to get indestructible. So again, you can use this, wipe somebody's board with a big creature. You can use it on a small creature and just get damage through with the big creature. It's a lot of versatility, and it's a really powerful card in the deck to go ahead. Again, I know the fight jumps out to as far as how you're going to draw cards, but a lot of these combat tricky things that control combat and force blocks are kind of more effective in that you can use them in more versatile ways. The last sorcerer I will talk about is one of our board wipes, and it's Azuri's Predation. This card is insanely awesome. It's not really anything surprising to be in most green decks. You're going to want board wipes, and this is just one of the most awesome ones in green. Just the fact that you can fight things on a board wipe, the synergy is kind of crazy there. Not to mention there's plenty of times if you get this out against a token deck or something, you might just win the game off of it the next turn. Surprise, we actually are running a Planeswalker in this deck. That's not typically what I like to do. I typically do everything I can to forcibly avoid Planeswalkers because I despise Planeswalkers so much, but that's okay. I'm not going to be petty in this specific circumstance, and I'm going to allow a Planeswalker in the deck, and it's because Domri is just too perfect. Domri's awesome. It can ramp us, make things not counterable, and allow things to fight. It's pretty awesome. I'll give it to him. This is a solid card. And then taking a look at the lands now. The lands, again, 2-color mana base. You can make it as simple as you want. I say this, I feel like every week. This land base, actually the important ones, are kind of similar to last week's deck tech. And it's the Gruul staples. We want stuff like Kessig Wolfrun that can pump things and give it trample, or Scarab that can also give trample. Those are I feel like in any Gruul deck, you might as well throw those in. You're not really losing much, and you have a huge upside to have these out in an important situation where you can give something trample or pump it like crazy. I also really like Rogue's Passage in the deck just because the thing with our commander, when we pump the creature, it also forces it to be blocked. And I realize most of the time if you're swinging with a big creature, your opponent's going to block it anyway. But it's just good to have unblockability mixed in. There are certain times where you can make something big and then swing at somebody, and maybe you have a combat trick plan, maybe you think they might not block. Whatever the reason is, the flexibility of Rogue's Passage is, again, you're not losing a slot, it's on the land, it's an awesome effect. Now, one interesting land that you are going to be losing a slot for, because it doesn't actually tap for mana, is Arena. This is a card where you just pay 3 mana and tap it to have 2 creatures fight each other. This is a really cool effect because it just has fight on it. The Oracle text, I believe, does actually say the words fight. So that does help, because if it didn't say that, it wouldn't be quite as good in the deck. But it's really cool removal, synergizes with your commander, so it is a cool card just to slot in. Now that is going to do it for all the categories. Let's move on to the best part of every deck tech, the game-winning step. How are we about to win the game with this deck? And there are some awesome ways to do so. One thing very interesting about this deck is, again, I kind of alluded to it earlier, this is meant for much more 75% playgroups. This is not going to be a deck that's going to be super explosive and winning out of nowhere. So a lot of these game-winning effects are going to be more so big threats that can end the game if not answered, as opposed to some cards in other decks that I do where it's cast it basically win on the spot. These are going to be much more threats as opposed to just immediate enders, and it kind of fits in the way with where I want the deck to fit meta-wise. One way to win the game is through a card called Vigor. This card is absolutely insane, and with all the fight effects we have, this card is just going to get ridiculous. Basically, when all your creatures get dealt damage, you just throw +1 counters on them equal to that damage. And because of fighting and because of getting blocked and all these different things our commander allows for, basically this turns into massive creatures everywhere. Typically when you play this out, people just don't want to block you. They just want to allow everything through just so nothing gets big and scary. But because our commander forces things to get blocked, because our big creatures are already fighting things, this will just get completely silly. And if it's not answered, not only will some of these fights to basically clear everyone's board, but you're going to end up with a massive creature you can just one-shot somebody with. So this is an immediate answer, and it is just an awesome card. It's a card I've been a fan of for a while, and I think this deck takes advantage of it as well as any deck I can think of. Now, the second card I want to mention is a card that Oh, I love it so much. It is, I think every deck with red, I'm just going to put it in the game-winning step and find a way to force it in, and it is Fiery Emancipation. This card fits into the perfect sweet spot for me, and it is the perfect balance of extremely powerful without it all being annoying, and very, very few cards can fit into that. And with the whole tripling concept, I know Nyx Bloom Ancient was the mana tripler, and that card is so powerful, but it is annoying. If I see it across the table, I'm going to groan. And hell, when I play it myself, I groan and don't want to see it anymore because it's just too busted. It just does too much. And this card doesn't. It's extremely powerful, but it feels much more interactable. It doesn't feel hopeless when your opponent plays it. Yeah, it's going to be dangerous. Yeah, you got to be careful because they basically have player death touch on some of their creatures now, but there are so many ways to play around it. It's the sweet spot. I don't know how else to express it. I love this card so much, but within the deck, I won't spend the whole time gushing about it. In the deck, it also is awesome because it will allow some of our awesome creatures to just take people out. If we get some of these big creatures that we give trample to, instead of dealing 4, 5, 6 damage, this late game will just end it for players if we can get damage through. Now the third way to win the game, it's no surprise, it is our weekly trip to Phyrexia. It is going to be Triumph of the Hordes. At this point, I just kind of want every deck with red and green to have Triumph of the Hordes and Fiery Emancipation as the win con because I just love the cards so much. They're amazing. And now this is going to be a playgroup choice. Some playgroups really hate Infect, like really dislike Infect, so you might have some salty players if you play this, but at the same time, I think it's just part of the game. There are so many broken combos and so many other things that just break the game. I think Triumph of the Hordes is a perfectly fair card. I think it's awesome. So this is, and especially in this type of deck, I already mentioned it's not a super powerful deck, and sometimes games need to end. This is the type of card this deck might need in order to close out games, because there's so much focus on value and fighting and drawing cards and different things like that. You need things to end the game as well, and this does a perfect job of that. And then the last way to win the game with this deck is really just going to be through a war of attrition. I know that's not specific, but it's something this deck will be really good at, is getting these big creatures out, clearing the board of your opponent's creatures, and drawing cards, essentially keeping your resources high, always having different types of removal and things like that, and basically making sure you have the biggest threats. And it'll allow you to swing in over the course of the game, consistently getting damage through, and really just win that war of attrition. It's not the primary way you want to go. These explosive ways that I've listed previously are much more consistent, I'd say. You draw those, you can just win. But even if all your win cons get countered and everything seems to be going poorly for you, the commander in and of itself allows you to play threats, refill your hand, and really just make sure you can get damage through. And that is going to do it for this week's deck tech. I really, really hope y'all enjoyed it. This seems like an awesome commander. And like I said, if you're in that play group where Xenagod is a little overwhelming, where you're winning a little too fast with it, but you still love that play style, I think this deck is perfect. I think in that 70-75% range of those decks, this can be a really, really fun deck that can still not durdle too much. You're still going to progress the game plan and have a good time. I love where it fits in the format. And as always, a huge, huge shout out to all the patrons. As always, we love and appreciate y'all so, so much. As always, tons of exciting stuff to come. But until then, I will see y'all next time.